Hi, I'm Ed Finn, Director of the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. What do you think humanity's first tool was? Sure, there's fire, there's pointy sticks, there's even language itself, but I think there is something deeper than all of those, a precursor that really defines what it means to be human: imagination. Now, you might think this word only applies in kindergarten or in art studios, but you would be overlooking a powerful tool that we use to understand the world and to change it. And if we want to talk about building better futures, you have to imagine them first. Neuroscientists call it the default network. Think about what you're doing when you're driving your car, you're mowing the lawn, you're taking a shower. You might be occupied in some surface level task, but your brain is at rest. Your mind can start to wander. You can think about what happened yesterday, a problem that you're noodling over, a conversation that you had, and your imagination is kicking in to take you to other times and places. It's this fundamental piece of cognitive equipment that is so ubiquitous, we've almost forgotten how to see it. And really, when you start to look at it carefully, imagination is the ignition system for all this other stuff we know we really care about, like empathy, foresight, resilience. Think about all the ways that we talk about imagination. Look before you leap, walk in another person's shoes, going back to the drawing board. Our language is full of metaphors for all of the ways that we imagine our way through life. And there's a rich trend in philosophical history exploring the way in which we talk our way through imagination, the way that we use the linguistic imagination, not just to see the world, but to make it. You could think about Plato's cave, or Bishop Berkley and Living in a Dream, or Wittgenstein and language games. These are all efforts to describe the incredibly powerful role that language plays, not just in describing the world, but in making it for us, making things real. Imagination is also the system we use to construct a working model of reality and tell the story of the self. So we imagine ourselves in different roles and situations. We spend huge amounts of time thinking about imaginary things like money and taxes and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And we order our lives by all this imaginary stuff. So there's this great Russian psychologist and cognitive scientist called Lev Vygotsky, who talks about constructivism, the way in which we construct our perceptions of the world. So if you imagine the self as one dot and the world as a second dot, there's a third point, there's a triangle. Every time you perceive something out in the world, it's not just a direct input into your brain. You actually go through an imagination step, a culture step, a context step, where you're taking most of the raw data that comes in from your senses, you're throwing it out, and you're taking little snippets of that data and editing it into a compelling story of the world. You're creating a narrative about what's happening right now and who you are. And that is a really powerful perceptual layer that we often ignore. There's a great paper I like to talk about, Pella, Pratt, and Cole, called Minding the Gap, where they explore how this works in your visual system, the way that your eye moves around, the saccades, the way that your visual system really samples the world, but our experience of the world is not a series of samples or still images, it's continuous. And imagination is at work throughout that whole process, stitching together the raw data into something that feels continuous, that feels like it makes sense to us. And I think we've all had that experience. You see something, you hear something that doesn't make sense, and sometimes your brain just throws it away. And this is how magic shows work. This is how ads work. We're constantly being invited into imagine particular stories. So I like to think about this system we've been talking about as the holodeck. Remember Star Trek, that amazing room where you can go in and you can be anybody and you can experience any kind of reality? We have that. It's right here in the brain. You have this incredible simulation right there on top of your shoulders that allows you to travel through time and space, become somebody else, walk in their shoes, try out new ideas, try out solutions. You do it all at the speed of thought, and all you have to do is eat some food and drink some water. It's incredibly cheap. So imagination is really this cognitive faculty that distinguishes us from every other species. Another book I like to talk about is Homo Prosepectus, psychologists, philosophers, neuroscientists talking about how you can really think about the whole story of human cognitive evolution and the reason we have these giant brains, these heavy things we lug around, cause all kinds of problems in the birth canal. We have these things in order to anticipate the future, in order to prepare. And they have this great line in the book: the reason that humans are the apex predators on planet Earth is not because we have the sharpest claws, it's not because we can run the fastest, it's not because we can jump higher, it's because we can see farther into the future. We can anticipate and plan. So in other words, imagination is how we solve hard problems, how we plan for the long-term survival of the species. We have a capacity to do this that no other species does. So imagination is the speculative faculty necessary to scaffold action and understanding. That's a quote from another great book on pragmatic imagination by Ann Pendleton Julian and John Seeley Brown. We need imagination as the method, as the toolkit for doing all of this anticipatory work. It's how we actually plan, how we build towards the future. It helps us contend with ambiguity and complexity. I always like to go back to the Romantic poet Jonathan Keats, who talks about negative capability. We have this ability to hold completely dissonant, contradictory ideas in our head at the same time. It's kind of amazing. And maybe that's part of what makes us human. We're complicated. Imagination also lets us achieve long-term goals and make long-term plans. Think about strategic planning, foresight studies, setting aside money or grain for the future. We have this unrivaled ability to plan ahead. And maybe most importantly, imagination allows us not just to ask what is or what could be, but what should be. It gives us the power to do moral imagination. We can think about what we want in the world, what equity and justice we should be working towards in the world. So you can ignore imagination, but you can't escape it. We're all going into the future together. And if you choose not to imagine that future, it's not like it's not going to happen. Still going to happen. It's just that you're letting other people drive the bus. Think about disinformation, misinformation, advertisements, all of the ways in which people are trying to colonize your imagination. Turn your imagination to their advantage, whether that's getting you really anxious and worried about something, really mad about something, really excited about some new product. A huge amount of what we do in culture is try to engage other people's imaginations and get them to imagine the things we want them to. Adrienne Maree Brown is an activist, a writer, a facilitator, and I really love the way she talks about this. She says we are in an imagination battle. If you think about someone who's getting evicted from their apartment, someone who's grappling with inflation and how they're going to pay their bills, someone who's trying to wrangle a medical bill or deal with a credit card company, we're all caught up in these vast systems of imagination that are putting us into particular lanes and forcing us into particular forms of action. And sometimes those are really systematically unjust systems, right? They're pushing us, or they're reinforcing systemic inequality, systemic racism. And so imagination battles are happening around us all the time. Now, seeing your imagination is the first step to changing what you imagine. Starting to recognize that you have this system. You're using it all the time. The holodeck is there. It's just that maybe you're handing the keys off to other people. What happens if you start to take the keys back? Start to imagine for yourself and be more conscious, more volitional about what you want to imagine. So we have a little activity for you. It's called the Imagination Inventory. There are more details below, but basically what we want you to do is start to think about all of the different influences on your imagination, the things that you imagine, the things that other people are trying to get you to imagine, just to make visible this capacity that you have that is so active in your life, even though you may not realize it. Why do this? The future is fraught. We are living through an era of imagination crises. Think about the pandemic, climate change, inequality, automation and AI, all of these different huge transformational changes that we haven't figured out how to wrap our minds around, how to imagine our way through, what kinds of stories we should be telling to motivate effective collective action. So we need to tap into this imaginative capacity that we all have, but we've largely forgotten about. That's what we do here at the Center for Science and the Imagination. We inspire collective imagination for better futures. We're really glad you're here too, by the way. So in our next videos, we're going to talk about the imagination feedback loop and how historically imagination has inspired real change. And we're going to talk about how you put your imagination to work to change the world. We'll see you there in the future.